This series of lecture segments will dive deeper into how personality is assessed, and in particular, how researchers assess personality using 4 distinct types of data: self-reports, informant reports, behavioral observation, and life outcomes. Some of the best recent research on the strengths and weaknesses of these 4 approaches has been done by Professor Samin Vazire of the UC Davis Psychology Department. So I've asked Professor Vazire to talk about this issue and some of her research.
If we want to study personality, we need to measure it. For example, if I want to know whether extroverts are happier than introverts, I need to measure people's levels of extroversion and their levels of happiness. Personality researchers have spent a lot of time and energy on figuring out the best ways to measure personality. In this series of lecture segments, I'll talk about what's good and what's bad about each of these ways. The 4 main ways of measuring personality are self-reports, informant reports, behavioral observation, and life outcomes. Self-reports are what they sound like. We just ask people to rate their own personality. This sounds easy, but there's actually a lot of science behind what makes a good self-report. First, not all aspects of personality can be self-reported. There are some things people can't or won't tell you about themselves. For example, if you want to know whether someone has a tendency to deceive themselves, that's probably not something you'd want to ask them directly, because by definition, people will be in the dark about whether or not they're the kind of person that's in the dark about themselves. Honesty is another personality trait that probably shouldn't be measured with a self-report. It's very likely that a dishonest person will lie to you about their dishonesty, though actually it's surprisingly common for people to admit that they're dishonest in self-report measures. Self-reports are a great way to measure personality traits that people are willing and able to tell you about. This encompasses a lot of personality traits. People know quite a bit about their own personality because they're always around to witness their own behavior, thoughts, and feelings. As the saying goes, wherever you go, there you are. Nobody else has access to such a wide range of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. You are the only person that sees you in every context. At work, at home, with friends, alone, with your dog. You could potentially be aware of your behavior, thoughts, and feelings in each of these contexts. What's more, only you have direct access to your thoughts and feelings. Others can see your behavior, and they might be able to infer what you're thinking and how you're feeling, but only you know. This privileged access to thoughts and feelings makes self-reports great for measuring personality traits that have to do with typical ways of thinking and feeling. For example, if I want to know if you're an optimist, a style of thinking, or if you're an anxious person, a pattern of feeling, then I should probably get a self-report from you. Your direct access to your thoughts and feelings makes you able to provide a very accurate report of these traits. Know that these self-reports aren't quite the same thing as the introspective approach that was used in the early days of psychology. In that approach, the researchers looked at their own thought processes in an attempt to understand the mind, and their introspections could easily be biased by their theories. When personality psychologists use self-reports, we're not reporting on our own thoughts and experiences, we're asking naive research participants who don't know about our theories to report on their thoughts and experiences. So they won't be biased by our theories. However, these naive participants may be biased by other factors, such as social norms, so we need to be cautious when asking for self-reports about some aspects of personality. For example, if I ask you for a self-report rating of how kind you act towards other people, you might think about how kind you intend to be to people, or whether you have kind feelings towards others, and that might lead you to overestimate how kind you actually act towards others. There's another important factor that could taint people's self-reports: how positively or negatively people view themselves. People differ in how much they like themselves, that is, they have different levels of self-esteem. This then affects how they view themselves on a whole range of traits. It influences their self-views of their own intelligence, attractiveness, likability, and so on. People with high self-esteem will rate themselves more positively than people with low self-esteem. This affects the validity of self-report measures of personality, but it doesn't make them completely useless. Despite the bias introduced by self-esteem, there's still a lot of validity to self-reports of personality. In short, self-reports are best for measuring traits that have to do with styles of thinking and feeling, and they're still pretty good for measuring traits that have to do with behavioral styles. People typically know more or less how they behave, even though their self-views might be tainted a bit by what they were thinking or feeling. Finally, self-report is an extremely popular way of measuring personality because it's the most convenient way. Self-reports are easy because it's usually pretty easy to get your research participants to complete a personality questionnaire about themselves. It just takes a bit of their time. Personality self-reports vary in their length. Some are as long as 360 items, which can take over an hour to complete, but there are more and more scientifically validated short measures, and these often take just a few minutes. Of course, there are also a lot of non-scientific self-reports of personality out there, many of which you can take on the internet. For research purposes, it's important to use one that has been scientifically validated, such as the Big Five inventory, which is also freely available on the internet, for example at outofservice.com.